Thank you for the pressure. Good evening, everyone. And it is an absolute pleasure for me to be able to stand here and discuss the book, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, with you tonight. It is the book that inspired a career in biology for me. And I first read the book when I was 17 years old. So the Divya that was young and that had the view of the world that was all black and white, and the intriguing idea of evolution in the gene-centric point of view, as well as the forceful narrative that Richard Dawkins has, inspired me in ways that I hadn't experienced before from a book of science. Mind you, that means that I had gone through enough textbooks by that time for 17 years. So considering that, that was the original motivation was not to read the book in order to understand more science. I did it more out of curiosity, and I was in high school and contemplating what next. That was not the motivation to read the book, to understand what next. However, it came at a very good point in time and pushed me towards a career in biology, and I'm very happy to discuss why it inspired me in that way. So the intriguing way evolution is rediscovered in this book in a gene-centric point of view is extremely inspiring, and I will try to convince you in what way this is. It has been an interesting self-experience also for me to try and reread this book now in my 30s, where the world is definitely more gray and less black and white. Not the depressive sort of way, the nice and fashionable sort of gray, not the depressive gray, but definitely more gray than black or white. So now with more moderation of thought, with the knowledge to understand the larger implications of the content of this book, and of considering all the recent developments that genomics has taught us in the last 10 to 15 years, I was myself very curious to see how I would process this book after 20 years or so. I will discuss this again towards the end of my talk. You as an audience, well, you are here because, like me, you have read and fell in love with the book with the most simplistic yet very convincing, compelling evolutionary argument that the selfish gene is, or you have heard enough praises and criticisms about this book and want to know what all the fuss is about. I will try to make this review a fair discussion for both these types of audience. 40 years after publishing The Selfish Gene, it has neither become completely outmoded nor eclipsed. Dawkins himself, in a very recent interview, said there is very little he would change about this first edition of the book. And very few authors can say that in an evolving era of biology books. In the spectrum of books about science, The Selfish Gene is special. This is because good books about science explain a concept to laymen, thereby inspiring a new reason of thought, or try to persuade convincingly with fellow scientists, sometimes with aggressive passion, to support their new theory. The Selfish Gene went on to achieve both and still managed to stay relevant in ideas that are currently evolving in biology. At the end of this talk, I will discuss some examples of its relevance in evolving new areas in biology today, and some examples where Dawkins himself has recognized that there is more room for discussion. So I'm going to start by reading a few snippets that showcases how Richard Dawkins delivers his story, and then give you an overview of the central idea of the book. 4,000 million years on, what was to be the fate of ancient replicators? They did not die out, for they are past masters of the survival arts. But do not look for them floating loose in the sea. They gave up that cavalier freedom long ago. Now they swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and in me. They created us, body and mind. And their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. They have come a long way, those replicators. Now they go by the name of genes, and we are their survival machines. We are all survival machines for the same kind of replicator, molecules called DNA. But there are many different ways of making a living in the world. And the replicators have built a vast range of machines to exploit them. A monkey is a machine that preserves genes up trees. A fish is a machine that preserves genes in the water. There is even a small worm that preserves genes in the German beer mats. DNA works in mysterious ways. You can now sort of see how powerful the narrative of the author is, and he describes the most complicated ideas in biology in very simplistic, compelling terms. In the preface, Richard Dawkins intends to startle the reader by calling people machines and robots programmed by genes. What does it accomplish? Seems provocative, but what does it accomplish? The dramatic use of metaphor captivates the reader's attention, no doubt, and at the same time helps visualize complicated concepts in biology without all the jargon involved. It leaves an unforgettable impression on the reader about how natural selection works. Dawkins is a skilled writer, and his intention is not only to explain evolution to a layman, but also to convince those familiar with the idea of evolution that there is a new way of looking at this familiar concept. For the use of metaphors, I will now resort to reusing the case that Dawkins uses to explain the central dogma of biology. DNA can be regarded as a set of instructions for how to make a body written in the A, T, G, C string of nucleotide alphabets. And that's all it takes, 4 sets of alphabets. Dawkins draws the comparison of cells' genetic code to every room of the building having a bookcase containing all the architect's plans for that building. So every room in the building having the entire architect's plan for the building. The bookcase in this case is in the cell is the nucleus that contains 46 volumes of genetic code called chromosomes in case of human beings. The pages of the book being a gene, although division between genes is not as distinct as pages of the book. It is a metaphor that helps you to visualize how this works in a cell. DNA has 2 fundamental aims. One is to faithfully replicate itself when the cell divides to make more of its own daughter cells. It has to do so without making alterations to the original code faithfully. Mistakes can happen. Mistakes that happen in the original code during copying are called mutations. Mutations can have large impact, either advantageous, favoring survival of the organism, or deleterious, or they can be completely silent. He jokingly states as to how some mistakes in copying have had large impact by comparing how mistranslated Hebrew word for young woman ended up being read as virgin in Greek, coming up with the prophecy, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." We all know about this. The other role is to use this code to instruct the fabrication of the building, which is the body. It does this by instructing the manufacture of a different kind of molecule called a protein. Proteins make up the physical fabric of the body, but also essentially carry out all the chemical processes, turning them on and off at precise times. Essentially, in these two slides, I have explained, using Dawkins' powerful metaphor, the central dogma of biological systems. No acquired characteristic is inherited and transferred between generations. No matter how smart you are, it is lost. Each new generation has to start from scratch. A body is thus genes' powerful way of preserving themselves unaltered. The plans for building the human body lies in 46 volumes, but in essence they are 23 pairs of volumes. One set of 23 volumes from the father, and one set of 23 volumes inherited from the mother. Each volume from the father can be regarded page by page as an alternative in the other volume that is inherited from the mother. For instance, page 60 of volume 1A from the father and volume 1B from the mother could be talking about the same, could be instructing the same individual trait in the individual. Say, eye color. Just that the father's version instructs for a blue eye and the mother's version instructs for a brown eye. Any given person can have only two versions of these volumes called alleles. How is it that if cells go on to make individual copies of themselves, many more identical copies of themselves, that we do not end up all identical? Well, sexual reproduction takes care of that. In sexual reproduction, another kind of cell division is at play. This kind of division occurs only in sex cells, in the testicles and ovaries, more specifically in sperms in the testicles and egg in the ovaries. A cell with 46 volumes divides into two sets of 23 volumes. One set packed in the sperm and another set packed in the egg. But when 23 volumes are packed in the sperm or egg, something bizarre, unusually bizarre, happens. Whole sets of pages are ripped apart from one copy of a volume to the other alternate copy. This process of swapping the pages, whole sets of pages from one volume into another, or bits of chromosomes from bits of DNA from one piece of chromosome into another, is called as crossing over. So any one chromosome in a sperm would be a patchwork of its maternal and paternal counterparts. And most importantly, the lifetime of one such characteristically made chromosome is one generation, just one generation. Crossing over makes sure of this and keeps us unique as individuals. As Bodmer explained, the function of sex is to facilitate the accumulation of advantageous gene mutations that arouse in separate individuals and passes it on to the next generation. Now comes the most central idea of the book. If while assembling sperm and egg, crossing over is to rip apart parts of the book and bind to another book, it is easier to conceive that the thicker the book, the larger the chance of this happening. In other words, the shorter the genetic unit, the longer the number of generations it manages to survive intact. It is less likely to be split by crossing over. This bit of chromosome that potentially lasts for enough generations to serve as a unit of natural selection is called a gene. A gene is not indivisible, but is seldom divided. I will read out now another metaphor that powerfully drives home the message. Just as whole boats win or lose races, it is indeed individuals who live or die, and the immediate manifestation of natural selection is nearly always at the individual level. But long-term consequences of non-random individual death and reproductive success are manifested in the form of changing gene frequencies in the gene pool. So here, Richard Dawkins compares gene to oarsmen that are operating the boat. Rivals for seat are the competing alleles, the competing volumes, alternate volumes. And rowing fast would be building the body that is capable of ensuring the survival of the fittest. And wind would be any external influence that can possibly change the direction of this. That individuals are selected or lost, affecting the gene pool that prevails, is still a valid point, but the gene is at the very center of this process. That's the alternate idea that Richard Dawkins brings to the table. In the end, it is genes that control development of an embryo, and they are partly responsible for their own survival by doing this due to the efficiency of the bodies that they help to build. That we are gene machines that evolve systems that survive to pass the gene from one generation to the next generation is the central tenet that is propagated by this book. Richard Dawkins argues that this is the case even in case of sophisticated nervous systems that we are so proud to have developed. We have built the sophisticated nervous systems for the purpose of successfully propagating the gene. That is his idea. While genes, like policymakers, control over behavior by providing the set of instructions to adapt to your environment and make decisions, the brain makes the moment-to-moment decision as an executive. Brain, memory, consciousness are increasingly sophisticated tools for scanning the environment and ensuring survival of the organism. Dawkins postulates that consciousness arises when brain simulation of the world becomes so complex that it should create a model of itself. But we see so many apparent acts of kindness around us. This paints a slightly bleak picture for many readers. And these apparent acts of selflessness around us, such as parents care for their children selflessly, there is care between close kins, acts that are altruistic in nature. Dawkins defines altruism as follows. An entity is said to be altruistic if it behaves in such a way as to increase another entity's welfare at the expense of its own. When an act of kindness is provided with an idea that it will be paid back, it is called reciprocal altruism. In the question of altruism, Dawkins takes an iron standing. He proposes one strategy that the gene uses to increase its numbers is to help its fellow replicas exist in other bodies. This strategy, although selfish on the gene level, appears altruistic at the level of the organism. Dawkins believed that recognition of kin relations of any kind, no matter how near or far they are, is nothing other than gene selection. When organisms perform seemingly unselfish acts for kin, they are merely following genetic programming to ensure survival of their selfish genes. This is his take on altruism. Kamikaze bees, for example, that protect the colonies from threats, die shortly after an encounter as their vital organs are torn apart in the stinging process. And they do so to protect their colony from rivals. Dawkins quickly explains this selfless act as a consequence of the bees being sterile. It is common to see alarming calls from birds, starting acts, as you see here, displayed by gazelles in the animal kingdom to warn other animals in the colony of a hunting predator. Dawkins argues if the alarming bird tries to get away without warning the flock, it is most likely to be eaten, whereas if all the birds fly up, it increases the alarmist's chances of survival. The emphasis on the idea that altruism is not natural to biological systems, that it has to be learned, is unapologetic in the book. Dawkins clarifies that he is not advocating a morality based on evolution. He is in favor of teaching people generosity and altruism since we are born selfish. For the purpose of this book, Dawkins says he is not interested if or not survival machines such as us are conscious. They act as if they are conscious. That's more the point, he says. He stresses over and over that he does not address conscious intentions of organisms, nor does it lay down social or political prescriptions on how human societies should operate. Naturally, this standpoint invited attention, some of it negative from philosophers and biologists as well. I will come back to this in a bit. In the last chapters, Dawkins analyzes how reciprocal altruism plays out in real life. To discuss this, he introduces the prisoner's dilemma, a gambling game political scientist Robert Axelrod and evolutionary biologist Hamilton used to explore altruism. In the prisoner's dilemma, two players have two choices: to either cooperate with each other against the authorities or to defect and give up their comrade. Each player is dealt with two cards, and neither knows which card the opponent is going to play. In outcome one, both cooperate and are awarded $300 by the designated banker, let's say. In outcome two, both players defect and are fined $10. In other outcomes, one person cooperates and the other defects. In each round, the defector gets $500, and the sucker who gives in, who cooperates, is fined $100. So the first outcome is good for both players, equally. The second, bad for both players. But the temptation to defect is strong because there is a possibility of winning a much higher reward. In a scenario where only one round is played and there is no way of knowing what the partner is going to play, a rational person will see that the best choice with the least risk is to defect, since the worst that can happen is that you're fined $10, while the best outcome is to win $500. An iterated game, however, changes the game completely because many successive rounds can make a large difference. There is a chance to build up trust or mistrust, to reciprocate or placate, to forgive or avenge. Axelrod wanted to work out which strategy would be the best to play this game. And he invited gaming experts to compete and come up with 14 different strategies, to which he added one additional strategy. And this was played against, it was turned into a computer code and ran several hundreds and thousands of times. The winning strategy, if you're curious, was a tit for tat, in which the player cooperates on the first move and then copies the previous move of the other player. Axelrod defined tit for tat as a nice strategy, meaning one in which no one ever defects first. 8 of the strategies submitted were nice and 7 were nasty. The 8 nice strategies were also the top scoring ones, if it has to warm our hearts in some way. Unforgiving strategies do not do well in this theory because they cannot break out of the retaliation cycle even when the opponent is remorseful. Tit for tat is also not jealous or envious, since it's just happy to have both players win. So, although the idea of gene-centric selection theory can sound selfish, how it plays in the natural world might have altruistic advantages. Human culture, however, works distinctly differently. He does recognize this. Human culture is a new kind of replicator, Dawkins says, and he coins the term meme, defining it as a unit of cultural transmission. It's the shortest chapter in the book, but has been the most powerful in terms of how well it has been recognized by people around the world. Just as genes propagate themselves in gene pool, by leaping from body to body, memes propagate themselves in a meme pool by leaping from brain to brain, via a process in the broad sense that can be called as imitation. Memes survive if they have a psychological appeal. Memes also compete in different forums of human media, such as books, billboards, television, or radio. Dawkins considers religion to be a particularly powerful meme. He speculates that a set of memes can become stable in a similar way as evolutionarily stable set of genes, suggesting an organized structure with all its architecture, the rituals, laws, the music. And this is a powerful example of how memes can function and become established over time. Unconscious memes may survive because of their deep psychological impact, such as the idea of hellfire, which is linked to the God meme. He says blind faith, by simply unconsciously discouraging rational inquiry, secures the longevity of the religion meme. So powerful was the idea of meme that it became a meme by itself. It percolated from a 1976 book into the Instagram era. In the last chapter, Dawkins discusses how genes manifest their effect beyond the organism itself. Phenotype can be defined as bodily manifestation of a gene, the effect that a gene, in comparison with its alleles, has on the body during development. Nature favors some genes over others because of their phenotypic effects. Phenotypic effects include all the effects that a gene has on the world and may reach outside the wall of an individual body. Dawkins calls this idea the extended phenotype. Some ideas of the extended phenotype examples are beaver dams or bird nests. The phenotypic effects of a gene can extend to other living bodies as well, as is the case of parasites living in host organism. All these aspects are discussed in his recent book, The Extended Phenotype, which we are not going to cover today. Dawkins jokes in the last chapter, you should stop reading this and get the new book. He considers The Extended Phenotype his best work yet. So there are quite a few ideas where the book needs to be more accommodative in thought. There are multiple anomalies that the book does not explain. One example being, surely the selfish child has to become the selfless parent at some point in time. How is this accomplished biologically at the level of the gene? In all sexual species, male and female individuals, the sex cells called gametes are much smaller and more numerous in males compared to females. All other sex differences stem from this one basic difference, according to Dawkins. Beginning with conception, the female egg contributes much more to the embryo in way of food reserves than does the male. This fact limits the number of children a female can produce, and while males can have unlimited number of offsprings. In Dawkins' view, female exploitation begins here. Natural selection produces two divergent sexual strategies, and Dawkins called the X strategy honest and the sperm strategy exploitative. But this does not explain the existence of maternally dominant colonies, which are quite easily seen in the natural kingdom. The last 2 decades of genomics era have vastly increased our understanding of DNA. Vast stretches of DNA that does not code for proteins are addressed as buffer DNA to lessen the effect of mutations and to ensure keeping the gene intact during crossing over process when bits of DNA are stripped off and are beginning to show important. These stretches of DNA, which are not coding for proteins, are beginning to show extremely important functions biologically. It is also now known that DNA can be chemically modified by extrinsic factors that can make them silent or more capable of being translated into proteins. This modification is capable of being transmitted through generations, and such a phenomena can affect the expression of gene. And the whole field of biology that studies this is called epigenomics. A powerful example of the influence of epigenomics was demonstrated in generations that followed mega famines across several different cultures. It was shown how specific stretches of DNA can be silenced and remain silent in successive generation by extrinsic factors, such as a famine. Dawkins received criticism that the book is very ignorant of the ideas of philosophy that dictate human culture, and this is a severe criticism from philosophers. Biologists such as primatologists, Franz de Waal, for instance, believes altruism can be more innate than we believe and can be instructed as any other behavior is. He studies moral behavior in primates and has strong ideas about fairness in animals. I will now show a video of his thought process to explain what an alternative idea might look like.
Of somebody else. And for decades it had been assumed that only humans can do that. Only humans worry about the welfare of somebody else. Now we did a very simple experiment. We do that on chimpanzees that live in Lawrenceville, in the field station of Yerkes, and so that's how they live, and we call them into a room and do experiments with them. In this case, we put 2 chimpanzees side by side, and one has a bucket full of tokens, and the tokens have different meanings. One kind of token feeds only the partner who chooses, the other one feeds both of them. So this is a study we did with Vicky Horner. And here you have the 2 colored tokens. So they have a whole bucket full of them, and they have to pick one of the 2 colors. You will see how that goes. So if this chimp makes the selfish choice, which is the red token in this case, he needs to give it to us. We pick it up. We put it on a table where there's 2 food rewards, but in this case only the one on the right gets food and the one on the left walks away because she knows already that this is not a good test for her. And then the next one is the pro-social token. So the one who makes the choices, that's the interesting part here. For the one who makes the choices, it doesn't really matter. So she gives us now a pro-social token and both chimps get fed. So the one who makes the choices always get a reward. So it doesn't matter whatsoever, and she should actually be choosing blindly. But what we find is that they prefer the pro-social token. So this is the 50% line, that's the random expectation, and especially if the partner draws attention to itself, they choose more. And if the partner puts pressure on them, so if the partner starts spitting water and intimidating them, then the choices go down, and they actually don't want to... It's as if they're saying, if you're not behaving, I'm not going to be pro-social today. And this is what happens without a partner, when there's no partner sitting there. And so we found that the chimpanzees do care about the well-being of somebody else, especially these are other members of their own group. So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group, they know each other, we take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here. Let me tell you, I still have 2 minutes left. Let me tell you a funny story about this. This study became very famous, and we got a lot of comments, especially anthropologists, economists, philosophers. They didn't like this at all, because they had decided in their mind, I believe, that fairness is a very complex issue and that animals cannot have it. And so one philosopher even wrote us that it was impossible that monkeys had a sense of fairness, because fairness was invented during the French Revolution. So, now, and another one wrote a whole chapter saying that he would believe it had something to do with fairness if the one who got grapes would refuse the grapes. Now, the funny thing is that Sarah Brosnan, who's been doing this with chimpanzees, had a couple of combinations of chimpanzees where indeed the one who would get the grape would refuse the grape until the other guy also got a grape. So we're getting very close to the human sense of fairness, and I think philosophers need to rethink their philosophy for a while. So let me summarize. I believe there's an evolved morality of somebody else.
So that final observation that the capuchin monkeys will refuse a grape until the other capuchin monkey receives a grape drives home the message that there is more to altruism, there is more to the behavior that we explicit than what is just innate. And Frans de Waal's idea is also revolutionary in the sense that he doesn't propose it as behavioral changes that are necessary to keep us more evolutionarily fit. He proposes that these behaviors are innate in us, that these could also be as much inscribed by genes as other behaviors are, that we are innately programmed to behave well. So despite the shortcomings, where there is plenty of room for discussion of alternative rooms of thoughts, can it provide the selfish gene, this book, can it provide us new takes in the era of genomics? Simply because of the fact that the book provides a very compelling argument of evolution in a gene-centric perspective, it is going to stay relevant for a very long time to come. But the idea of gene-centric evolution can also inspire us to think and relook at known concepts in a different way. One example would be the case of evolution of cancer. All cells in the body have identical gene content. However, some rogue mutations can provide a cell with a survival advantage that can get selected as the cell goes on to divide, and can cause it to propagate it to more daughter cells. The cell with the survival advantage goes on to accumulate more mutations and simultaneously make clones, resulting in cancer. This is the original idea of thought with which cancer biologists were operating and evolving therapeutic ideas, but this is beginning to change. In a field of cancer, it was originally believed that 4 to 5 independent mutations have to happen in the same cell in order for it to escape the cancer check that the immune system does and cause the disease. However, now with all the advances in our ability to look at gene mutations at a single cell level with increased precision, we now know that the formation of cancer can be viewed as multiple events that can happen in independent evolving cells. Once the first hit that affects the cellular check mechanism has happened, each clone of a cell can go on to acquire independent combinations of mutations, and the best combination of mutations provides the survival advantage to the tumor. It is a simple evolution of the idea of thought, but you can immediately see how it affects the way we look at the disease and how different it would be to approach cancer than therapeutically. So even in the modern genomics era, the idea of genes building cells and evolved systems can inspire us to look at familiar knowledge from a new angle. I rest the case saying controversies, arguments, and all, the selfish gene is worth tickling your brain.